Actually listening to Evan and Jim and making a few notes, just some things I've remembered from their presentations I've learned along the way. So here's sort of a top 10, just quick points you might want to write down. Number one, on interviews, assume you have one opportunity to speak to the person you're going to talk to. So it's really important to elicit the information you need, the board needs. So assume that one time you have to sit down or on the phone, that's your one shot. So make that assumption going into it. The second, especially if you're using an interpreter during the interview, and I'll have an example a little bit about that, but if you're using an interpreter, you should try, and certainly in big cases, our office will certainly try and have 2 NTSB employees to be sitting in the interview, because this, when you have a question and you're giving a question to the interpreter, that interpreter then turns to the question to the person being interviewed, and it can get complex very quickly. So the office directors or chiefs may want to consider that if that is going to be the case. 2 recorders that was mentioned. That's, again, if there's 2 NTSB employees or maybe there's a Coast Guard person in the room, make sure there's at least 2 recording devices in the room if you're going to do that. Make sure the cell phones are off of the participants. If you're sitting down doing an interview, you don't want those distractions. Also, consider the room that you're going to be doing the interview in. There's a lot of, on ships we experience a lot of AC noises. So you're sitting in a passenger lounge and you don't even hear it. You get the recording and it's completely white noise and static and you can't do the transcription. So keep that in mind. Also schedule breaks. I like to tell the participants, both the party members and the interviews and their representatives, hey, at 11 o'clock we're going to take a 10-minute break. I get to be a bit of a slave driver sometimes and I just keep going through. We all get in that mode. We're type A, we want to get this interview, we got another one coming. Make sure that you take time for breaks. Everyone's tired, you don't want to create another disaster. Also, get permission to record. We talked about that. I found it's very, very good to bring an example of a transcript with me. And so when you have concerned party members, all these questions we just talked about, I bring a copy of a transcript with me to show them what the final product is, and almost immediately they just drop their objections. They can see that a court reporter, something they're very familiar with, format, and they generally drop their objections. Written statements. Oftentimes we arrive on scene, the Coast Guard has got there before us, and they have a written statement. Sometimes NYPD, they have a written statement. It's very useful to read that before you interview the person. So if there's copies around, get the IIC or whoever to get those statements to you before you interview the person. Also, and this came up very recently, make sure that, fortunately we weren't the ones involved, make sure that you make the witness identify themselves. Show you a photo ID. I'll tell you really quickly, Coast Guard interviewed someone in a case within the last month or two. The person they were speaking to who identified themselves was not the person they were speaking to. The person they were speaking to was a wanted fugitive for some other offenses. I don't know what they were, but there was a wanted fugitive who used his brother's identification, told the Coast Guard he was actually his brother. The Coast Guard actually took a statement from a wanted fugitive. That person disappeared. And so anyway, it would be useful to identify and make sure you're talking to who you think you're talking to. Get the contact information, get their email address, their phone numbers, so you can follow up if you need to, which just comes to the following, the last point. At the end of the interview, ask them if you can contact them and make a follow-up interview if necessary. So you've started that conversation. If you need to re-interview, you've sort of opened that door right at the end of the interview process. So you've sort of set up that possibility, which may be necessary in the future. Okay, so now I'll get into my topic is really about all the people in the room. Everyone in the room has a different purpose, and we need to make sure everyone in the room knows what is going on, what the final product is going to be, what their rights are, and what the process is going to, how it's going to play out. So we're going to be briefing the people that are in the room. In our case, NTSB employees, Coast Guard employees, the company of the ship. If it's a collision, ship A, ship B, If it's a manufacturer, class society, other flag state representatives, that room can get very crowded in a short period of time. So we make sure we're briefing the folks asking the questions, we're briefing the people who we're interviewing, and we're also briefing their representative. And that's kind of what this presentation is about. In Marine also, I just want to tell you that some of the peculiarities of our mode, we operate generally almost under 3 separate sets of rules. For one investigation will be in one set of rules. If we do a different investigation, may fall under another set of rules. So we have the NTSB rules when we lead. We have about 30 accidents a year, maybe 2 or 3 are actually NTSB-led investigations. The second are Coast Guard rules, which is almost the rules that we generally fall under. Their rules are radically different than ours. They have what they call parties of interest, where the lawyers are asking the questions. So it's a conflict with our whole mode of operation under NTSB rules. And the third is what's happening right now in the Bahamas is a foreign, in the aviation you guys do the accredited representation, but in Marine we have the same thing. We're an under flag state as the lead investigation, and we're actually participating on behalf of the United States. We have to follow their rules. We just have a case right now in the Bahamas. They actually gave us a sheet saying we were to submit all of our questions in advance, and the Bahamas representative would ask all the questions, and that would be the end of the interview. We, of course, immediately objected and said, no, we will give you the topics of conversation, but our investigators would ask our own questions, particularly because you have follow-ups. I mean, we have to do that. So those are the 3 types of rules we operate under. Give you a quick story. My first days at the board in 2003, I took the basic investigation course for 2 weeks. I was sitting in my apartment in Arlington, and week 3, my pager goes off. I thought it was the fire alarm or the microwave oven. It was the old pagers that we had, and I never heard it go off. And it was the Barbary, the Andrew J. Barbary Staten Island ferry had crashed into the dock in New York. There were eventually 11 people died and about 75 critical injuries. It was a very big accident in Marine at the time. I was sent up as the operations investigator, and of course we had to talk to the captain who survived. And we made several attempts through the lawyer to speak to the person. We kept giving promises that, yes, we would speak to the captain tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. The chairman went on TV and said, we're speaking to the captain tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Day 2, didn't show up. Make another interview appointment. Day 3, didn't show up. Every night the chairman is telling the press and the public that we're going to speak to this person. It never happened. Finally, the decision was made to issue a subpoena to force the captain to appear. We issued the subpoena. The person was told to appear at 9 o'clock on day 4 or day 5. Lawyer received the subpoena. Yes, sure, we'll be there 9 or 10 tomorrow morning. Didn't show up. Now we have a decision to enforce the subpoena, which we went to federal court in Brooklyn, enforced the subpoena. And the federal judge asked the captain's attorney, will you show up, what time? And we'll be there tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Okay, done. So at the Coast Guard the next morning, the room was full of Coast Guard, NTSB, Coast Guard Investigative Service, NYPD, City of New York, table almost as big as this over the Coast Guard headquarters in Staten Island. And I'm now, 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks at the board now, and I'm leading this interview with probably as many people as are here. And I'm supposed to interview the captain of the Andrew J. Barbary, who now has 11 fatalities and 70 injuries. So we sit down, we start the interview. Question number 1, what's your name? Looks at his attorney and he says, oh, my name is XYZ. Question number 2, what's your age? Looks at his attorney, I'm 39 years old. Okay? Question number 3, what's your city and state of residence? This is attorney. Piece of paper comes out, invokes his 5th Amendment. At that point, the interview for almost all the law enforcement, everyone else in the room, interview's over with. He's invoked his 5th Amendment rights. Not for the NTSB. If you're an investigator for us, you want to you want to identify all the particular acts of information about that accident you might want to get. In this case, the procedures, what happened, the navigation buoys in the area, and so on. I had an Excel spreadsheet of maybe 300 questions, potentially I might ask. And so I started, the general counsel said, no, ask every question that you were going to ask. Let them take the fifth to every single question. So we began that, and eventually we just sort of said classification, navigation aids. I asked a few questions, he took the fifth on each one, and we said, okay, can we stipulate you'll take the fifth on every question I ask about navigation aids? I respectfully would invoke my Fifth Amendment rights, and so on, and so it went for a couple hours, and that was the end of the interview. Unexpected? No. We knew the person was going to take the fifth. However, strategy error on my part, that I didn't realize question number 3 was going to put him in jeopardy. It put him in jeopardy because New York City rules dictated that he had to be a resident of New York City to work for the city of New York. He was living in New Jersey. So by asking him a city and state of residence, it put him in a jeopardy right away, and he took the Fifth Amendment. That's why. So that was my first, one of my first interviews, and I'm sure it's in the docket somewhere, so you can look it up. Okay, so that's why this can be very important. It can sort of set the tone for an investigation. Interviews are important for what we do. Parties, we're familiar with the rules, but the people in our industry sometimes are not familiar with the rules. Maybe in aviation is different, but in marine, every single time, we're sitting there explaining the party process. So, giving process and then sticking to it is important. Not just for the interviewees, but certainly for their representatives. So, not just identify yourself, the interviewer and the interviewee, make sure you identify yourself. Give them a business card, let them know who they're talking to. And during this process, if you have any questions on scene, ask the IIC, and or the General Counsel is always available at extension 6080. Or have Jim on speed dial. Okay. So by the time the interviews begin, oftentimes we've already had the opening meeting, and the parties have been identified. In the marine, oftentimes we don't have a lot of groups because the small companies just don't have the manpower. The managers, and perhaps the port captain, port engineer, they only have 1 or 2 people in the process, so we have to keep that in mind. But more importantly, the person that signs the party agreement may not be the person in your interview. And they may not realize that what they've just witnessed in this process cannot be released to the public. Make sure the group members in your interview understand the rules of the party process. Their boss may know it, they may sign the form, but make sure everyone in your room understands at least the fundamentals, that what's going on here belongs to the NTSB and is not to be released. It's also important for your group, members of your group, to have expertise. We've got some new investigators in Marine. I'm really talking to them here, but make sure that the folks that are assigned to your group, if you're talking about engineering, make sure that the party member has some inkling about marine engineering. So you may want to, before the interview begins, just get a quick background of what that other group member might be, their experience. All this is defined in the party forms, which can be found on the internet. And perhaps your office can hand you what the party form that the party coordinators are signing. Make sure you have a copy of that if you're one of the group chairmen. Okay. So again, all these forms can be found. Hopefully, in Marine, part of the process I came over in June to take over this job, and part of my job now is going to make all new forms and repositories for all of our information so that it's easy for us to get to, both on scene and here in the office. But here's folks down in Bahamas right now, they have no internet. So don't rely that you can get a form off the internet if you're going to be a remote area. So have a few forms with you in your go bag, attendance sheets, the party forms, and I've given our new investigators a few of those to bring with them.
working, can I say something
Sure.
right here? This list that you see on this slide is actually on our intranet. And in your packet is one of those forms called the Record of Conversation form. And I put that in there because I wasn't even aware it was there. It's interesting too to go in there and see the various party forms for the various modes, because they're all a little bit different in those forms. But I just wanted to have that information.
Right. And you may want to consider in your different modes making some changes to this. We talked about personal information and the transcript. You don't want to have personal information in the final transcript. We have to redact it. In fact, the Coast Guard has now objected to us including the names of the investigating officer being released to the public at all. They now consider their Coast Guard investigators law enforcement, and they don't want their names out in the public. So normally we have an interview transcript that says, you know, Liam LaRue, NTSB or something. Now we're just going to have some Coast Guard investigator.
Wow.
Or, you know,
Wow.
so we're entering a new era of personal protection for ID, and just consider that in your interview process and get some guidance from Jim as to what you need to do, or from your office director or chief. One consideration here, yeah, sir.
The form you mentioned, if from what you just mentioned, you normally including their names on the form, but you still have it somewhere written, correct?
Right. So what I'm telling you is collect personal information, their name, perhaps their age, their address, phone number, on a separate record. That record can then be put in the official use only side of the docket, because it's all going to be personal information. If you redact it, it would just be a whole black, you know, CIA form. But we've received forms now from the Coast Guard, literally with the entire form has been completely blacked out. I made a presentation recently to them, a PowerPoint slide which is completely blacked out just to get their attention. But, you know, basically speaking, it's not just NTSB now, other government agencies now are going to be facing this. So get all your personal information, put it in official use only side for your later use. We had a situation on an international investigation involving an interpreter, and you want to make sure that interpreter also understands the rules and what's going on. So that they have just general, you don't give them the whole lecture, but just make sure they understand they're not to step outside the door and reveal something about the interview. Liam, just a quick synopsis of those Mexican interviews and the use of the interviewer, how that went.
So we had an accident that occurred down off the coast of Mexico, and half of the survivors were native Spanish speakers. And so in a perfect world, we would have had an interpreter from the State Department or something like that. We were doing these interviews down in Mexico. So the investigator in charge from the Coast Guard was a Spanish speaker. And so she basically was leading the interviews as well as serving as the interpreter. So it was interesting just because you would ask a question, she would interpret, she'd get an answer, and then sometimes she wouldn't give you the answer right away. She would go back to them and, you know, continue the conversation. So it's not an ideal situation as far as that goes, but we kind of made it work and made the best of it. Yeah.
So yeah, the actual person asking the question, in this case, on behalf of the Coast Guard, she was the party representative asking a question of the person, but she was also supposed to be the interpreter.
Right.
So we weren't getting the interpretation. It was a mess. Be aware when there's interpreters involved in the investigation, it can be challenging. Make sure you have the resources there. Maybe you can talk to general counsel or division chief to help you out. So.
And just this picture also is another accident I was involved with. This one was a fishing vessel in Alaska that sank. So we were doing the entire investigation in Dutch Harbor, or the initial phase of the investigation in Dutch Harbor. Anybody been there? There you go, all right. Or if you've seen Deadliest Catch,
Deadliest Catch, it's way out there.
That's way out there. So end of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. It's a very small town, hard to get to, even harder to get out of. And so we were doing interviews, and there were 2 Japanese crew members. And so, as luck would have it, one of the locals on the island, I think she worked at like the